Victoria Langley never expected that giving terrible financial advice to a stranger at a coffee shop would lead to anything more than a momentary laugh. Yet there she stood, staring at the multi-million-dollar estate that belonged to the very man she'd jokingly told to invest everything in extinct animal cloning just 3 weeks earlier. Lucas Barrett was used to people telling him what he wanted to hear. As the founder and CEO of Barrett Industries, a global shipping empire worth over $300 million, sycophants surrounded him daily. What he wasn't used to was the refreshing honesty, or in this case, the absurd sarcasm of a coffee shop barista, who clearly had no idea who he was when he'd casually asked for investment advice while waiting for his Americano. That rainy Tuesday morning at Brood Awakening had started like any other for Victoria. She'd been working the morning shift, handling the pre-work rush with practiced efficiency. The tall, unassuming man in the charcoal suit had been polite but distracted, scrolling through his phone while waiting for his order. "Rough morning?" Victoria had asked, noticing his furrowed brow as she handed him his coffee. "Just trying to figure out where to allocate some capital," he'd replied absently. "Any suggestions?" It was the kind of throwaway question that wealthy customers sometimes asked baristas, not because they wanted real advice, but because they enjoyed the momentary power dynamic of a service worker scrambling to sound intelligent. Victoria, who'd been up since 4 a.m. and was in no mood for patronizing banter, had decided to have a bit of fun. "Definitely extinct animal cloning," she'd said with a perfectly straight face. "Huge market potential, low competition, you could corner the dodo bird industry." She'd expected a dismissive smile or perhaps an eye roll. Instead, the man had looked up from his phone, really looked at her for the first time, and laughed a genuine, unexpected sound that had transformed his serious face. "That's the first honest response I've heard in months," he'd said, dropping a 20 in the tip jar. "Most people would have stammered out something about tech stocks or real estate." "Well, if you want actual financial advice from someone making minimum wage plus tips, you might need to reassess your strategy," Victoria had replied with a shrug. He'd smiled again, lingering a moment longer than necessary before heading out into the rain. Victoria had forgotten about the encounter entirely until 2 days ago, when the same man had returned to Brood Awakening, this time with a proposition that seemed even more absurd than investing in dodo birds. "I'd like to hire you as my advisor," he'd said, sliding a business card across the counter. The embossed lettering read, "Lucas Barrett, CEO, Barrett Industries." Victoria had initially thought it was a joke, but a quick internet search on her break confirmed that Lucas Barrett was indeed the reclusive shipping magnate whose fleet dominated international waters. "I don't know anything about ships or business," Victoria had protested when he returned for her answer. "That's precisely why I want to hire you," Lucas had explained. "I'm surrounded by yes men and industry experts who all think the same way. I need someone who sees the world differently." The salary he'd offered for a 3-month consultation period was more than Victoria would earn in 5 years at the coffee shop. With student loans crushing her and her mother's medical bills piling up, she'd reluctantly agreed. Now, 2 days later, Victoria stood at the entrance to Lucas Barrett's coastal mansion, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. "Miss Langley, welcome." A housekeeper greeted her at the door. "Mr. Barrett is waiting for you in the study." Victoria followed the housekeeper through the sprawling mansion, trying not to gawk at the museum-quality art that adorned the walls. The place was beautiful but strangely impersonal, like a luxury hotel rather than a home. The study was at the back of the house, overlooking the ocean. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a spectacular view of waves crashing against rugged cliffs. Lucas Barrett stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the sea. "Victoria," he said, turning as she entered. He was dressed more casually than she'd seen him before, dark jeans and a light blue button-down with the sleeves rolled up. It made him look younger, more approachable. "Thank you for coming." "I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here," Victoria admitted, taking the seat he offered her. Straight to the point, I like that, Lucas smiled, sitting across from her. The shipping industry is changing rapidly. Environmental concerns, automation, alternative energy sources were at a turning point. Barrett Industries has been successful because my father and I have always anticipated change rather than reacting to it. Victoria nodded, trying to look like she understood the complexities of global shipping. But lately I've been stuck. Every idea my team presents feels safe, incremental. Nothing transformative, he leaned forward. Then you suggested extinct animal cloning with such conviction that for a split second I actually considered it. Victoria couldn't help but laugh. I was being sarcastic. I know, but that moment of cognitive dissonance was valuable. It made me think differently, even if just for an instant. Lucas stood and walked to a sideboard where he poured 2 glasses of water. I don't actually expect you to understand the intricacies of international shipping or finance. I want you to disrupt my thinking. By giving you intentionally terrible advice, Victoria asked skeptically. By giving me your unfiltered perspective, you see the world through a different lens than I do. That has value. He handed her a glass. For the next 3 months, you'll attend key meetings, review proposals, visit our operations. You'll tell me exactly what you think, no matter how naive or outlandish it might seem. Victoria took a sip of water, considering his proposal. And if this doesn't work out? If my disruption is just a waste of time, then you still get paid in full, and I'll write you a glowing recommendation for any job you want. Lucas shrugged, but I don't think that will happen. Their conversation was interrupted by Lucas's assistant announcing that his executive team had arrived for their scheduled meeting. Perfect timing, Lucas said. You can start right now. The next few hours were a blur as Victoria sat silently in a boardroom, while 6 impeccably dressed executives discussed cargo capacity optimization and fuel efficiency innovations. She understood perhaps 1 word in 10, but she observed the dynamics, how the executives deferred to Lucas, how they competed subtly for his approval, how certain topics seemed to energize or bore him. When Lucas finally asked for her thoughts, the room fell silent, 6 pairs of eyes regarding her with varying degrees of curiosity and disdain. You all sound exactly the same, Victoria said bluntly. Different voices saying identical things. And you're all focusing on making the existing system slightly better rather than questioning if the system itself makes sense anymore. The silence that followed was deafening until Lucas burst out laughing. That's exactly what I needed to hear, he said, dismissing his stunned executives. Once they'd filed out, he turned to Victoria. Now, tell me what you really think. Over the next few weeks, Victoria's role evolved in ways she never expected. She attended meetings, visited shipyards, and even flew with Lucas to Rotterdam to tour their European operations. At each step, he sought her unvarnished opinion, often in front of executives who clearly resented her presence. But something strange began to happen. The more time she spent with Lucas Barrett, the more she saw beneath the billionaire facade. He worked harder than anyone on his team. He remembered the names of dock workers and administrative assistants. He listened intently when Victoria spoke, not just to her business observations, but to her personal stories as well. Why did you become a barista? He asked one evening as they flew back from Rotterdam on his private jet. Victoria laughed. I didn't become a barista. It's just a job that pays the bills while I figure out what I actually want to do. And what's that? She hesitated, unused to being asked about her ambitions. I studied environmental science in college. I wanted to develop sustainable agriculture systems for urban areas. But then my mom got sick, and I had to drop out to help care for her. The medical bills. She trailed off, embarrassed to be discussing financial hardship with a man who could buy a hospital if he wanted to. Lucas didn't respond immediately, his expression thoughtful. What if shipping containers could be repurposed for vertical farming in port cities? He finally asked. Victoria blinked, surprised by the connection he'd made. That could actually work. The infrastructure for movement is already there, and most ports are near urban centers. They spent the rest of the flight discussing the concept, with Victoria sketching potential designs on the back of a napkin. It was the first time she'd felt intellectually engaged since leaving college, and the enthusiasm with which Lucas built on her ideas was infectious. By the time they landed, Victoria realized something unsettling. She was beginning to like Lucas Barrett, not just as an employer, but as a person. And judging by the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the feeling might be mutual. The thought terrified her. Lucas lived in a world of wealth and power that she could barely comprehend. She was a temporary disruption in his life, nothing more. Getting emotionally attached would only lead to disappointment. Despite her reservations, Victoria found herself looking forward to their meetings. Lucas had begun scheduling them in increasingly casual settings, walks along the beach near his home, dinners at small local restaurants, even a farmer's market one Saturday morning. Their conversations ranged from business strategy to philosophy to personal stories, and Victoria discovered that, beneath his success, Lucas was deeply uncertain about the legacy he wanted to leave. "My father built this company from nothing," he confided as they walked along the shoreline one evening, the setting sun painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. "He knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. I've always felt like I'm playing a role that was written for me." "Is that why you hired me?" Victoria asked. "To help you break character," Lucas smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Maybe, or maybe I just wanted someone to see me as a person, not a balance sheet." Their hands brushed accidentally as they walked, and Victoria felt an electric current run up her arm. She pulled away quickly, reminding herself of the professional boundaries between them, but those boundaries were becoming increasingly blurred. When Lucas suggested they visit a vertical farm operation in the city to research their container farming concept, it felt more like a date than a business outing. When he insisted on driving her himself rather than sending his usual car service, Victoria knew she was in dangerous territory. The farm was housed in a converted warehouse, with hydroponic systems stacked 12 levels high. As they toured the facility, Victoria couldn't help but notice how Lucas watched her more than the farming operation, his eyes warm whenever she expressed enthusiasm over a particular technique or technology. "You light up when you talk about this," he said as they left, the afternoon sun warming the city streets. "It's captivating." Victoria felt her cheeks flush and quickly changed the subject. The container concept could work. "With modifications to allow for proper light and irrigation, we could create mobile farming units that could be deployed anywhere in the world." Lucas repeated, smiling. "I like the sound of that." That evening, instead of returning to his estate, Lucas suggested dinner at a small Italian restaurant tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The place was intimate, with only a dozen tables and soft lighting that made everyone look their best. "This doesn't feel like a business dinner," Victoria observed as they were seated at a corner table. "It's not," Lucas admitted, his usual confidence tempered with uncharacteristic nervousness. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Victoria's heart raced. "Lucas, the 3 months are almost up," he interrupted. "Your contract ends next week." She nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that washed over her. "Right, of course. I'd like to offer you a permanent position." Victoria blinked, surprised. "As your professional disruptor." "As the head of a new division, Barrett Sustainable Solutions." Lucas leaned forward. "The container farming concept is just the beginning. I want to transform how we think about shipping, not just moving goods, but addressing global challenges. Food security, disaster response, renewable energy distribution." Victoria was momentarily speechless. It was an incredible opportunity, one that aligned perfectly with her abandoned dreams. "I don't have the experience to run something like that," she finally said. "You have the vision, which is rarer and more valuable." Lucas reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Victoria, these past months, you've changed how I think about my company, about my future. You've changed me." The intensity in his eyes made her look away. "Lucas, I don't know if this is a good idea. The power dynamic between us would be addressed," he finished. You would report to the board, not to me directly. Your position would be secure regardless of anything else that might develop between us." Victoria withdrew her hand. "And what exactly do you think might develop?" Lucas sat back, considering her for a long moment. "I think you know, I think you feel it too." She couldn't deny it. Despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance, she'd fallen for Lucas not for his wealth or status, but for the thoughtful, complex man beneath the billionaire facade. "I do," she admitted quietly, "but that doesn't make it simple. Nothing worthwhile ever is." Lucas smiled. "Take the weekend to think about the job offer. As for the rest, that's entirely up to you with no pressure and no expectations." Victoria did think about it obsessively over the weekend. She made pros and cons lists, called her mother for advice, and even returned to brood, awakening to work a shift, hoping the familiar routine would clear her head. It was there, making lattes and chatting with regular customers, that Victoria realized what she really wanted. The coffee shop had been a safe harbor during difficult times, but she was ready for a new challenge. And despite the complications, she wanted to explore whatever was developing between her and Lucas. On Monday morning, she arrived at the Barrett Industries headquarters with her decision made. Lucas was waiting for her in his office, trying and failing to look casual as he pretended to review documents. "Yes," Victoria said without preamble as she entered. Lucas looked up, hopeful but cautious. "Yes to both the job and the rest." She took a deep breath. "But I have conditions." "Name them," he said immediately. "First, I want complete autonomy over the new division. If I'm going to do this, I need to do it my way." Lucas nodded. "Agreed. Second, I want to finish my degree. The company can help fund research in sustainable agriculture, but I want the credentials to back up my position. We already have an educational assistance program, but I'll make sure yours is fully covered." Victoria took a step closer to his desk. "And third, if the personal side of our relationship doesn't work out, the professional side remains intact, no matter what." Lucas stood, moving around the desk to stand before her. "I would never compromise your career over personal matters. You have my word." "Then we have a deal," Victoria said, extending her hand professionally despite the flutter in her stomach. Lucas took her hand but didn't shake it. Instead, he gently pulled her closer. "May I kiss you now? I've been wanting to since you suggested I invest in dodo birds." Victoria laughed, the tension breaking. "That is possibly the strangest lead-up to a first kiss I've ever heard." "I'm an unconventional man," Lucas murmured, his free hand moving to her waist. "And I give terrible investment advice," Victoria replied before closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was tentative, a question rather than a statement. The second was more certain, a mutual acknowledgement of feelings that had been building for weeks. By the third, Victoria had stopped counting, lost in the sensation of finally being in Lucas's arms. When they finally broke apart, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you, I don't do anything halfway. If we're doing this, I'm all in." Victoria smiled, her hands still resting on his chest. "I figured that out when you hired a barista as a consultant based on one sarcastic comment." The transition from consultant to division head was challenging, but Victoria threw herself into the work with enthusiasm that infected her growing team. The container farming project moved from concept to prototype within months, with a successful pilot in a food-insecure neighborhood near the port. Her relationship with Lucas evolved alongside their professional collaboration. He introduced her to his world, gradually intimate dinners before charity galas, weekends at his beach house before international business trips. Victoria was relieved to discover that, beneath the wealth and status, Lucas's values aligned with hers in all the ways that mattered. She also discovered that rumors about office romances spread quickly in corporate environments. Some employees assumed she'd slept her way into her position, while others recognized her genuine contributions. Victoria learned to ignore the whispers and let her work speak for itself. 6 months after accepting the position, Victoria stood on the deck of a Barrett Industries ship, watching as the first fleet of farming containers was loaded for deployment to drought-stricken regions in North Africa. Lucas stood beside her, his arm around her waist. "Not bad for a terrible advice giver," he teased. Victoria leaned into him. "I still think dodo bird cloning has potential. We should put some R&D money into that next." Lucas laughed, the sound carrying across the water. "You know, I actually looked into it after you first suggested it." "You did not." "I did. Turns out the technology is closer than you'd think, but the profit margins are questionable at best." Victoria shook her head in disbelief. "You actually researched extinct animal cloning because a random barista suggested it." "Not random," Lucas corrected, turning to face her. "The woman who would change everything." 1 year to the day after Victoria had given Lucas that fateful, sarcastic investment advice, they stood together on the balcony of his coastal home, their home now watching the sunset over the ocean. "I have something for you," Lucas said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Victoria's breath caught. "Lucas." He opened the box to reveal not a ring, but a small golden pin in the shape of a dodo bird. "To commemorate the worst financial advice that led to the best decision of my life." Victoria laughed, relief and affection washing over her. "You had me worried there for a second." "Oh," Lucas raised an eyebrow, reaching into his other pocket to produce a second, smaller box. "Were you expecting something more like this?" Inside was a stunning emerald ring, the green stone surrounded by small diamonds that caught the fading sunlight. "Victoria Langley," Lucas said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "you walked into my life and completely disrupted everything I thought I knew. You made me question my assumptions, reimagine my company, and rediscover what really matters. Will you marry me?" Victoria looked from the ring to the man holding it, this complex, brilliant, surprisingly vulnerable man who had become the center of her world. "Yes," she said simply, "but only if you promise to occasionally listen to my terrible advice." "For the rest of our lives," Lucas promised as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Their wedding 6 months later was an intimate affair on the beach behind their home, with only close friends and family in attendance. Victoria's mother, now in remission thanks to treatments that Lucas had quietly ensured she received at the best medical facility in the country, beamed from the front row. As they exchanged vows with the sound of waves crashing behind them, Victoria marveled at the improbable journey that had brought them together. A chance encounter, a sarcastic joke, and the courage to pursue something that seemed impossible, these had combined to create a love story neither of them could have anticipated. That evening, as they danced under the stars at their reception, Lucas whispered in her ear, "You know, I never did thank you properly for that investment advice." Victoria laughed. "How so?" "It made me a much wealthier man," he said, spinning her gently. "Not financially. Barrett Industries is doing fine, but that's not what I mean. You made my life richer in all the ways that actually matter." Victoria rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "And to think it all started with the worst advice I could possibly invent." "Sometimes," Lucas said, holding her close as they swayed to the music, "the best things in life come from the most unexpected places." 2 years later, as Victoria rocked their newborn daughter in the nursery of their home, she couldn't help but agree. The path that had led her here from barista to corporate executive to wife and mother had been anything but conventional. Yet every unexpected turn had brought her exactly where she was meant to be. Lucas appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened after a long day at the office. "How are my girls?" he asked softly, crossing the room to place a gentle kiss on his daughter's head and then his wife's lips. "We're perfect," Victoria answered truthfully. And they were not because their life was without challenges, but because they faced those challenges together. As their daughter drifted to sleep in her arms, Victoria smiled up at her husband. "Any investment advice you need today?" Lucas laughed quietly. "Just one thing. Where should I invest my heart?" "That's easy," Victoria replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Right here with us. It's the only guaranteed return on investment you'll ever find." And as Lucas Barrett, shipping magnate, visionary entrepreneur, And the man who had fallen in love with the woman who gave him terrible advice gathered his family in his arms. He knew it was the soundest investment he would ever make.